the Palestinians launched two popular uprisings against the Jews and the British blatant pro-Zionist policies. The first took place in 1929 and claimed hundreds of Palestinians and Jewish lives. The second, in 1936, was practically a small-scale war between the Palestinians and the British, who were also aided by the Zionists. It lasted for 3 years, and in the end, approximately 5,000 Palestinians died. The British also exiled the Palestinians' leadership and dismantled all Palestinians' paramilitary units. The Palestinians were left defenseless and leaderless.
Severe violations of human rights and civil rights in Palestine today. Most of these violations were invented not by a Jewish Zionist mind, but by British mandatory authorities in the war against the Palestinians between 1936 to 1939. Examples: the idea that you demolish houses of people is a British invention. The idea that in order to make a search memorable to people, you destroy a house and then you move to the other house, and then to the other house, and then to the other house, was an invention by British officers on the ground. The idea that you shoot people without warning them, or you arrest them without trial.
From the beginning. The only way to realize the Zionist project was unilaterally and by military force.
Tensions between the indigenous Arabs and Jewish immigrants simmered throughout the 20s and 30s, with sporadic outbreaks of violence, contained for the most part by British military rule. The kibbutzim and agricultural settlements the Zionists had built as socialist utopias increasingly resembled armed fortresses, each with its own wall and tower, guarded around the clock from potential Arab attack. Military training entered the curriculum as young people were recruited to the Haganah, or Jewish Defense Force. 1936 witnessed the most serious crisis yet.
We went on strike for 6 months. We boycotted both the Jews and the English, but it started with the English. At that time we used to tell ourselves that if we only got rid of the English, we'd be able to deal with the Jews ourselves.
But getting rid of the English was easier said than done. And far from leaving, the British rulers attempted to crush the uprising by force, greatly expanding their military presence and establishing curfews in the major cities. More than 120 Arabs were sentenced to death and many more imprisoned. The main Arab leader, Hajj Amin al-Husseini, fled Palestine to escape arrest. But these measures failed to quell the violence.
At St. James's Palace, a conference is hoping to arrive at a solution of the Arab-Jewish problem of Palestine.
And in 1939, the British announced a major policy change. The White Paper set quotas on Jewish immigration for 5 years, after which time a binational state would be established, with any further Jewish immigration being contingent on Arab support. The Jews felt utterly betrayed.
In April 1936, the Arabs rise in revolt against the growing number of Jewish immigrants. An open letter to British forces in Palestine from the leaders of the Arab revolt.
The cruelty is to try and deprive us of our homes and our honor, to give our lands to the Jews, who are expelled by all the civilized nations. We are your friends if you behave faithfully. We are men of dignity and valor. We will never betray you, but you are our enemy when you try to do us harm.
After attacks by the Arabs, the the Jews arm themselves and fortify their settlements. The British send in extra troops. Major David Kennard, Coldstream Guards.
18th of October 1936. After Lydda, the line twisted up the sides of the ravines. The scenery was fascinating, but no vegetation of any kind, just loose stones. One of the men was heard to remark, "Cor blimey, I thought that this was a land flowing with milk and honey. Well, as far as I can see, it's 15 men to a tin of milk and no bloody bees."
As the revolt continues, the British Army rounds up hundreds of Arab suspects.
The whole battalion cordoned Silwan. We searched it, finding 70 wanted men. One Arab woman was in a frenzy, tearing her hair and her garments. I stayed behind to help our informer. We had great difficulty getting away, as the women had rushed the prisoners and tried to lynch our informer.
Arab suspects are interned in detention camps. A young Arab leader.
In the old days, the Arabs never objected to the Jews. Nobody begrudged them the Wailing Wall and what it meant to them. But when the Jews became Zionists, it was a different matter. Now they are arrogant and aggressive. Our relationship with them is impossible.
The British High Commissioner in Palestine, Sir Harold McMichael, September 1938.
The position is deteriorating rapidly. This Arab revolt is an attempt to achieve the complete reversal of government policy regarding Jewish immigration.
With war looming against Germany, the British government does reverse its position. Britain will need its Arab allies and their oil. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, April 1939.
We are now compelled to consider the Palestine problem from the point of view of its effect on the international situation. If we must defend one side, let us offend the Jews rather than the Arabs.
The British decide to limit Jewish immigration so that a future Palestinian state will be controlled by an Arab majority. The Jewish settlers are left barricaded in their camps. Colonel Richard Meinertzhagen, a British officer who served in Palestine during the First World War.
The action of His Majesty's government in Palestine is very near to that of Hitler in Germany. We have dishonored our promises to the Jews. After 20 years of incredible effort in Palestine, the Jews are asked to abandon their national home at the bidding of Arab violence.
But it will be the violence of the Second World War which will change forever the history of Palestine.
There were many options for the British. They didn't choose the right ones. And maybe it's easier for me to say it in hindsight, but there were options they didn't choose. And these options would have undoubtedly benefited the indigenous population of Palestine and would have disadvantaged the Jewish community. But they haven't taken these decisions. They took decisions that basically benefited the Zionist project and proved to be catastrophic.
The British did good things in Palestine. They built roads and schools and developed a modern economy. But once they had declared their support for a Jewish state and at the same time promised to protect Arab rights, they were passengers in a car crash.
I think they trapped themselves into this conflict. They put themselves in the middle when they promised one side something and they promised the other side something which is contradicting. And then whenever they tried to balance one step that they made, then the other side will be angry and vice versa.
With Arabs outnumbering Jews by 10 to 1 in Palestine, the implementation of the Balfour Declaration would inevitably mean the displacement of many thousands of Arab families. This would create a lasting desire for revenge.
We are at the graveyard in which the most important tomb is that of Ezzedine Al-Qassam, the leader of the Palestinian guerrilla movement of the 1930s who fought against the British, and whose name now is the name of the main military wing of the Hamas. And it's also the name of the missiles which are being fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel. This was where he used to preach what we will call today probably political Islam or Islamic fundamentalism. That the only way of pushing forward national ambitions such as independence and self-determination or the eviction of the British and the Zionists could only be through the Islamizing of the society.
For Al-Qassam, there could be no separation of politics and religion. He called for a jihad, a holy war against the British. As Arab insurrection against their rule escalated through the 1930s, the British were forced to call in experts in counter-terrorism. The wall that snakes through Palestine, dividing Jew from Arab, was the brainchild of Israeli Prime Minister Ariel Sharon in the 1980s, and was designed to keep Palestinian terrorists out of Israel. But the Israelis were not the first to build a defensive wall. In 1936, the British sent their greatest anti-terrorist expert to Palestine. Sir Charles Teggart, known as the strong man of Bengal because of his ruthless suppression of Indian nationalism, had the idea of erecting an anti-terrorist barrier along the borders of Palestine. These are Teggart's own drawings, showing exact details of the fence's construction. He also built dozens of concrete guard posts. He imported attack dogs from South Africa and established a center in Jerusalem to train interrogators. The death sentence began to be meted out. Then, Teggart was joined by another of the British Empire's hard men, Orde Wingate. Wingate was another committed Christian Zionist. From his arrival in 1936, he saw his part in the creation of a Jewish state in Palestine as being a religious duty and the literal fulfillment of Christian prophecy.
A British officer impassioned by the Zionist cause, Captain Orde Wingate, offers to teach the Jewish settlers how to organize themselves for fighting. He teaches them one strategy: To defend yourself, resist. To survive, attack.
Wingate set up special night squads made up of British and Jewish soldiers. Every night, groups of 8 to 20 men would patrol and set ambushes near Arab villages. This was to be a private army to counter terrorism with its own. Wingate is remembered today as a founding father of the Israeli Defense Force.
He has the most important place, I think, in the pantheon of Israeli heroism. This person really pushed forward the military power of the Zionist settlement towards collective actions against the rural community, and most of the Palestinians were living in rural communities.
The British want peace at any price. They try to restore order, search everybody. They act as if both sides are equally guilty. And in fact, British administration retreats from objectivity a little more with each Arab act of violence.
For some politicians, the escalation of violence came as no surprise. As Winston Churchill asked,
"Can it be expected that the Arabs would stand by impassively and watch the building up with Jewish capital and resources of a Jewish army equipped with the most deadly weapons of war until it was strong enough not to be afraid of them?"
ضربنا 6 أشهر واحنا هناك مشان يمنعوا البيع الأرض ومشان والأرض والهجرة يمنعوها. ما استجابوش إن أبدا قط من الإنجليز. إحنا صرنا ضد الإنجليز بعد خرجنا عن العصيان المدني إلى جماعة مقاتلين. فهمتي؟
Bashir Ibrahim is 100 years old now. In 1936, he joined the Arab Revolt against the British.
نروح ناخذ هذول المواصير ونروح بالليل فهمتي من الطرق هاي اللي بنوكها الجيش نيجي نكحف من هون ومن هون ونحطهم فهمتي وني يبقى
كان معك سلاح ولا بس ألغام؟
سلاح كيف بس ألغام يبقوا من هون 10 مسلحين من 10 مسلحين مش يعني لما السيارة اللي ينجى واحد أو السيارة تكلي بيظل يرشوهم.
Demolishing the homes of Arab civilians, shooting handcuffed prisoners, forcing local Arabs to test areas where mines may have been planted. These sound like the sort of accusations made by Arabs today about Israel's recent military actions. In fact, they are descriptions from official British documents of the methods used by the British authorities to combat Arab terrorism.
عاملونا معاملة ما واحد عاملها في الأرض في الظلم القتل والذبح دواما انت شايفين مش اليوم في قتل وذبح ها مش فيه ها هذا ولا شيء بجانب هذا.
But as the deaths of British soldiers and policemen increased, there was little sympathy from the government for the Arab protests. As Lord Dufferin remarked from the Colonial Office,
British lives are being lost, and I don't think that we, from the security of Whitehall, can protest squeamishly about measures taken by the men in the front line.
By the Second World War, Britain had more trouble on its hands. While millions of Jews were being murdered by the Nazis in Europe, in Palestine, they felt that the British were not hard-nosed enough in their support for a Jewish nation. They too turned to terrorism. As the spiral of violence continued, the British ended up fighting two enemies. The British public, their politicians, and now even the army had had enough. The Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Henry Wilson, summed up their exasperation.
The problem of Palestine is exactly the same as the problem of Ireland, namely, two peoples living in a small country, hating each other like hell.
The Palestinians launched two popular uprisings against the Jews and the British blatant pro-Zionist policies. The first took place in 1929 and claimed hundreds of Palestinians and Jewish lives. The second, in 1936, was practically a small-scale war between the Palestinians
and by military force.
Tensions between the indigenous Arabs and Jewish immigrants simmered throughout the 20s and 30s, with sporadic outbreaks of violence, contained for the most part by British military rule. The kibbutzim and agricultural settlements the Zionists had built as socialist utopias.
British invention. The idea that in order to make a search memorable to people, you destroy a house and then you move to the other house and then to the other house and then to the other house was an invention by British officers on the ground. The idea that you shoot people without warning them or you arrest them without trial.
From the beginning. The only way to realize the Zionist project was unilaterally.
Palestinians and the British, who were also aided by the Zionists. It lasted for 3 years, and in the end, approximately 5,000 Palestinians died. The British also exiled the Palestinians' leadership and dismantled all Palestinians' paramilitary units. The Palestinians were left defenseless and leaderless.
Severe violations of human rights and civil rights in Palestine today. Most of these violations were invented not by a Jewish Zionist mind, but by British mandatory authorities in the war against the Palestinians between 1936 to 1939. Examples: the idea that you demolish houses of people is a